Short little video there, of course, on Machu Picchu, of course, famous citadel that was built by the Inca Empire, of course, back in the 15th century. So, anyway, welcome you back, Daniel Simon at Baton Rouge Community College. Hope you're having a great week out there. Of course, going into week three, of course, fall semester of this History 1123 class. So, hope everybody had a great Labor Day weekend. I think today is a great day, hopefully, for you as well. So, yeah, it's kind of a short week for us, going into week three. I know because we had that day off on Monday. But of course, I'll be wrapping up, the Conquest of America lecture, of course, from the one previous last week, part one I did before. So, anyway, I hope everybody's having a great morning overall. Looks like we do have a bunch of students I know watching live right now. Hey, Joshua, what's going on this morning? So we're having a great morning, great weekend before. Lulu, hey, good morning. Brianna, hey, good morning. It's like Steph and also Elizabeth, good morning. Ashlyn, Christopher, also good morning. It looks like we got a few more joining us right now. Test Destiny, good morning. Also Destiny as well. And of course, Antonio and also Brittany as well. So anyway, kind of get started today. Of course, I do have a few announcements I did need to talk about. I do have a new announcement, of course, I do have today, which I will be posting a new assignment for the week, which is going to be on the course Conquest America. Of course, we're talking about last week and this week, so there will be a quiz on that coming up, which I'll post today in Canvas quizzes. There should be one already up, of course, on exploration quizzes, which I think that's going to close this week. So if you haven't done that, try to wrap that up. And don't forget, I do have those Canvas discussions out there if you want to earn bonus points, for the study guide questions and all that. There's some sections on Canvas. I'll try to send emails out about that again. But you can, of course, earn a lot of bonus points for that during the semester. So kind of just some of the basic announcements I got right now. I think the vocabulary is due next week too. I think week 4. I know that's coming up. I might push it back though because of Labor Day. So anyway, of course, today I'm going to get to my main thing. Of course, we'll talk about lecture wise. Of course, I am going to discuss, the rest of what happened with the conquest of America. I'll kind of talk about the Spanish. Of course, they take over a majority of the Americas, pretty much from the western part of where the United States is all the way down into Central America and most of South America minus Brazil. So I'll kind of talk about, Spanish colonialism, which they were pretty much in control of parts of Latin America for over 300 years at one point. So I'll kind of get into that topic, of course, today. So if you have any comments, questions during the live stream, let me know, or you can, of course, always leave me comments later. If you want to subscribe to the channel, you also can, of course, as well. If you want to join me at StreamYard.com, there's the link, of course, below for this live stream right now. But of course, most of you will probably watch this recorded, of course, later. Now, I'm, of course, going to continue talking about the Spanish, how they, come into the Americas and they conquer America. Of course, here, kind of showing you kind of a map of the Americas right here. On the left, you can see all that area that's pretty much in green. There is going to be an area that's going to be conquered eventually by the Spanish, pretty much by the 18th century. They conquer a majority of that area. Other areas, of course, are not. You see Portuguese take over the area of mostly where Brazil is. They call it the so-called viceroyalty of Brazil. But you can see from the western part of the United States, Mexico, Caribbean, Central America, most of the western part of South America are pretty much controlled by the Spanish, for quite a long time, up to like at least up to the early 1800s. They're in control of it for a while. So that's one thing I'll probably talk briefly about later because you get all these, different states that kind of emerge out of that after the so-called Latin American revolutions, of course, break out. Now, I'm going to talk about today, one of the main topics, of course, we'll get to first, is talking about Francisco Pizarro. I think I hadn't quite gotten to that yet about Pizarro. You can see there Francisco Pizarro, image of him in that statue on the left. I think we kind of mentioned about him before, but Pizarro, was a famous conquistador, especially in the early 16th century, that conquered eventually what we call Peru, which is in the western part of South America. He's very famous for conquering what is the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire was one of the last of the pre-Columbian states that existed in the Americas before the Europeans came and all that. And He was actually, if you know much about Pizarro, he actually originally came to the Americas with Vasco Nunez de Balboa in 1513, when Balboa, discovered the Pacific Ocean, where Panama is now today above South America. And he was kind of instrumental in, they think, in establishing what we call Panama City, the capital of Panama today, which I think at one point he may have been a mayor at one point. But early on, Pizarro had heard about some kind of El Dorado, which was in South America, and so starting way back in the 1520s, he started several expeditions to try to go down into Peru, into South America, which for like 3 or 4 years were not successful at all. He attempted several times to go down there, and it was a total failure. And I think he ended up on an island off the coast of northern Peru, or might have been actually Ecuador. And There's a famous image you may have kind of show here of Pizarro right here on the right, but you can see he's going to get down to eventually down to where Peru is. You can see on the left, right there in that image. I guess pushing down through, Colombia and into, Ecuador and Peru in that area you're looking right there. I think he was off on an island somewhere called Gayo Island with his men. There was kind of like a little foothold in the Americas at that point before they would eventually invade into South America. And a lot of his men didn't really want to go on this expedition because I guess they were dying and they felt like it wasn't going to go anywhere at all at that point. And he drew a line in the sand. The famous painting, I guess, was made years ago, showing this image where basically Pizarro challenged his men to, push inward into the Americas. And he made the famous comment, which was, "There lies Peru with its riches, here Panama and its poverty. Choose each man what best becomes a brave Castilian." This 1527, I think, was the year when he made that statement. And supposedly only 13 conquistadors actually crossed that line. Now, he drew that line in the sand, basically. And I think they were later nicknamed the famous 13, or I think in Spanish, Los Trece de la Fama, I think was the other nickname they called it too in Spanish, originally. But within a few years, he would, find his El Dorado. That's one thing that Pizarro will eventually do at that point. And a little background about Pizarro: he came from a little city in Spain called Trujillo, Spain, and he was actually from a very poor background. I think his, I think his, I think he didn't really know his father, if you know about this, and he was illiterate, never really learned how to read and write. And I think for years he worked as he was a swiner, like dealing with pigs or something like that. Was his early life, and then the early 1500s he decided to go to the Americas and seek his fortune. And so Pizarro is he's really a, if you study about Pizarro, he was like really old compared to other conquistadors. I think he was in the 60s when he died, I believe, Pizarro. And so he's going to eventually search out his, so-called El Dorado that he'll eventually try to, find. He had this business partner I did want to mention that was kind of famous, named Diego del Almagro. I think early on in his career, he worked with him to seek his fortune in the Americas. I think first in Panama and then in South America. And the only thing was the two later went to loggerheads, if you know about that, after he took over Peru. And he had Almagro killed. And I think later Almagro's son killed Pizarro in return. So it was almost like the mafia, like controlling South America after the conquistadors took over Peru. and eventually the crown would have to come in and take control, which will be later. Also, they had other ones, other people involved. Pizarro had brothers that were involved. Juan, Gonzalo, Hernando, Pizarro. They were all brothers that also came from Spain and were involved in the conquest as well of Peru. And don't forget about Hernando de Soto. Hernando de Soto, we know more for discovering like the Mississippi River and all that. It was definitely one of the men that was also involved in the conquest of Peru, and he's the one that eventually would take their main capital with his forces, which is Cusco, which is a little later. Now, going back to that image I was showing earlier of the Inca Empire and what is South America, the western part of South America, right there. If you study about the Incas were a Native American Peruvian state that was way up in the Andes Mountains. Some of the Andes Mountains, I think, are like 12, 13,000 feet tall. So way up in there. And the Incas were actually called the Quechua people or Quechua people. Really Quechua, I think is how they pronounce it, which was based off of a language system that was later written down, I think, after the Spanish came in and conquered it. I think only the Maya had an actual written language in the Americas. But the Incas were led by this ruler, who I think they call it either Inca or Inca Sapa, I think is the term they use, which Incas were kind of equivalent to almost like an emperor, and they were almost seen as being part god. Because I think the main god that the Incas worship was the sun god Inti. And so the Inca ruler was seen as the son of the sun god. That's how powerful he was. And I think some people even compare the Inca rulers to like almost like the Pharaoh of Egypt or something like that. The Incas, by the way, had a massive empire. They talked about how it was 2,500 miles, I think, from north to south, from Ecuador down into Chile and all that. But they do think that the length of all the roads were actually maybe longer than some of the roads of the Roman Empire, like thousands of miles of roads. And most of the roads were actually up in the mountains of the Andes. That was the amazing thing about, of course, the Inca Empire. But Pizarro would eventually push down into Peru by 1532. In fact, Pizarro had a smaller force than Cortes. I think Cortes had maybe had 500 conquistadors or more. I think Pizarro was like 200 men or more that he might have had. So he had a much smaller force that he eventually would, take basically Peru at that point. And what happened was he eventually came to a city. If you look at, he started where Tumbas is, which is like a little town that's kind of in the northern part of Peru. Then he pushed down to that city called Cajamarca, you can see, which is kind of like north of Cusco. And eventually he battled against the Inca ruler in that city, the Battle of Cajamarca. And the Incas thought they were going to just meet basically some kind of parlay between the Incas and the Spanish, because the Incas didn't really know much about the Spanish and who they were. And the Spanish would, of course, if you know about it, introduce, of course, the Inca ruler. We'll kind of show here. Where is he? I think he's right there. Atahualpa. Atahualpa, of course, was the Inca, one of the last Inca emperors that you have. And the meeting took place, of course, in November of 1532 between the Spanish and the Incas. And one of the first things that the Spanish tried to do with Atahualpa was they tried to basically, hey, this is our religion, Christianity, and they basically showed in the Bible and that you need to convert to, to our traditional religions. And I think they say that what happened was Atahualpa looked at the Bible, spit on it, and threw it on the ground like it was nothing. And so the Spanish basically used that as I guess a means to attack the Incas. And like I said, they would eventually captured Atahualpa at the Battle of Cajamarca. And so with that, they basically cut the head off of the snake. And they were able to basically take control of the Inca Empire. There's a very famous story that they always talk about, which I'll kind of discuss here. Of course, is the image of kind of like the Battle of Cajamarca, which, by the way, the Incas later kind of view it as being like a massacre, really. And so, forget how many Incas were killed in the battle, but it was several thousand. But it would eventually lead to the fall of Cusco, which you see here in that image right there. Cusco would fall right afterwards, with Hernando de Soto's forces, I think, taking it right after. But to try and save, if you know about Atahualpa, the Incas decided to ransom him. Is what they did. They had this famous ransom room or house you're looking at right there, which is in actually Cajamarca. And Atahualpa agreed to give the Spanish tons of gold and silver if they would free him. I guess not kill him or whatever. And I forget the exact number, but they seem to think that the ransom amount was 24 tons or something like that of gold and silver. And supposedly the room size was about 432 square foot, is what I calculated how size the room was. So I think a legend is they drew a line on the wall and told the Spanish that he would fill the whole room with gold and silver, and they didn't believe him that he could do that, but he did. But they do think that the amount of gold and silver that the actual Incas had was way more. We're talking like, I think there's an estimate that maybe they have like 700 tons of gold and silver. Now, a lot of it that the Spanish never got. They reneged on the ransom thing. And I think there's a legend of the so-called lost Inca gold you may have heard of, where they hid most of it in the Andes Mountains, and the Spanish never found it. And I think people have been looking for it for like several centuries, trying to find it. Of course, part of why they reneged on it, if you know about, was that they had him killed. If you know about this, Atahualpa, of course, here in that image right there, was eventually executed in the next year. They were actually going to burn him at the stake, but they said that if he would basically convert to Christianity, that they would have him strangled instead. And so he was what they call garroted. If you know what that is, it's a type of uh, strangulation device where they basically suffocate you and kill you right there. And so they sat him in a contraption like that and turned that thing until it basically strangles and suffocates you to death. So that's how Atahualpa was basically killed. And a lot of people thought it was just awful what they did with that, the Spanish, by killing Atahualpa at that point. So that's kind of what occurred with that, with the Spanish doing that. So with that, they're able to, the Spanish are then able to then take over, basically, or at least to try to take over Peru, which they will at that point. By the way, they have made movies about the conquest of the Incas and what happened to Atahualpa. I think the most famous movie ever made was in 1969, which was based off of a play by this man named Peter Schaefer, and it was called The Royal Hunt of the Sun. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's got Robert Shaw, who plays Pizarro. I think Robert Shaw is more known for playing in like the movie Jaws. You ever seen the movie Jaws? And then Christopher Plummer played Atahualpa, of course, on the right. I think that's kind of a scene on the right, showing the ransom thing where he's going to give him the ransom money and all that. Of course, they let him go, but of course he reneged on it, and Pizarro had him killed. Of course, is what happened. So, kind of a tragic story about what happened with Atahualpa. Of course, if you know about Pizarro, Pizarro is very famous for founding Peru. Peru, if you know about it, later, Lima is the main capital, which is on the Pacific Ocean, largest city pretty much in Peru today. I think that's the actual official date of when Peru was originally founded, January 18th, 1535. And so from there, the Spanish are going to start conquering, South America and expanding it and creating like, Peru becomes like the other viceroyalty colony that they have, of course, in the New World, besides, of course, New Spain overall. Now, I'm also going to talk about two other things that happen as well. It wasn't over. That's one of the weird things about what occurred with Pizarro's conquest of basically of Peru at that point. They do have this other incident that happens right afterwards, which was it's called different names. I think they call it the Inca Rebellion of 1536, but I think in South America they also call it the Great Inca Rebellion as well. And what happened after Pizarro took over Cusco and they had killed Atahualpa at that point, they put in this puppet ruler who was named Manco Inca, who was, I think, like a brother. I think he was kind of related to Atahualpa, like a brother, a half brother. And he would be like the puppet ruler for several years afterwards, from the 1530s, I think, up to the 1540s, supposedly, although he rebelled against him. And I think 1544 is when he died. And anyway, what happened was they mistreated Manco Inca. I think there was even a case where Pizarro killed his wife on top of that. And so, what happened was they rebelled. Like the rebellion itself would last like something like 9 months, and it led to the so-called siege of Cusco, which was the main part of it. Where what happened was the Incas, in a massive army, which I don't know if it was that big, 200,000 warriors, but at least 100,000 at the most, they think it was. They took back the capital of Cusco, and Pizarro had to get reinforcements to try to take it back. And Anyway, it led to a lot of atrocities on both sides that were committed. They fought over this huge fortress that was in Cusco called Sacsayhuaman, which you see right there. In fact, the Incas tried to hold out at that site. You're looking there, and you can see some of the massive stonework that they were talking about Machu Picchu. Some of those stones you're looking at weighed like almost like 100 tons, to kind of give you an idea of their weight. And that was one thing that really impressed the Spanish about all the stonework that they had there. A lot of the stones were actually taken away from that site and was used to build later what is now the Spanish Cusco city that will be built, of course, later afterwards. But yeah, his forces eventually were defeated. That's the one thing about Manco Inca. He wasn't really able to defeat the Spanish forces. Also, disease, I think, like smallpox and so on, decimated his forces, and they couldn't handle the Spanish firepower and all that. And so what happened was Manco Inca eventually fled to like the jungles of Peru, and he eventually forms a new state, which I guess the term they use for it is the Neo-Inca state, with its capital at Vilcabamba, which is actually kind of a region of Peru. I think it's in the eastern or southern part of Peru today. And Vilcabamba was this city that he basically reconstructed in the jungles of Peru, like it's, I think, close to the headwaters of the Amazon. And it became known as the lost city of the Incas. And For years, the Spanish couldn't find it, but eventually they would. They would have to move it. And I think there was another site called Vitkos, which was kind of nearby. Rosapata, I think is another name they called it. And later they actually would live there as well. I think sometimes Vitkos is kind of confused with the original Vilcabamba, which is now ruins in the jungles. But Eventually they found Manco Inca, and he was eventually killed, is what happened. They did have a few other rulers afterwards that reigned until like the 1570s that were there. There's some few others you may have heard of. There was one named Tita Kusi that reigned, and then one of the last ones that reigned you may have heard of was Tupac Amaru, who reigned over this Neo-Inca state up to like 1572. And he was, I think, some of the last rulers later were like the sons of Manco Inca that kind of struggled onward to try to continue this Inca state that was separate from what the Spanish were building to the, I guess, to the north or west. And so he after he was captured too and murdered. Um, Pretty much after that, the Spanish start taking over all of South America minus Brazil. You may have heard of that name, Tupac Amaru. It's of course a famous rapper. Of course, was named that. Of course, later, and that's kind of where the name originated from the Americas a long time ago. So, so anyway, kind of talking about what happened, with the Pizarro's conquest, of course, of Peru, which was very bloody. He did kill off a lot of the indigenous peoples, and he got very wealthy off of it. But he didn't live much to see it because he was murdered by his own men. That's the only thing about that. Oh, of course, they were talking about in the video about Machu Picchu. Apparently, the Spanish never found it because of the fact that the Incas had abandoned it right before the Spanish actually came. And so, for a long time, it was unknown. Very few people knew about this citadel that was high up in the Andes Mountains until really 1911 when Hiram Bingham, who was an American archaeologist and professor, found it, of course. And so that's what became a wide known thing now. It's a big tourist attraction, of course, today, as you know, in Peru. So I'm going to, of course, move on. We're gonna talk more about some other things, of course, what happened after, of course, the initial conquests of Peru, which of course keep going. They could conquer the rest of South America as well. We also have to look into, of course, the different colonies that were set up by the Spanish after this, of course, all occurred with the conquistadors coming in. The initial conquest, at least in the 16th century, spawned the first really Spanish colonial viceroyalties that are created afterwards. The two main ones, which I kind of already talked a little bit about, New Spain, which New Spain was composed of predominantly like Mexico and part of Western, like America now today. Caribbean was in it. I think later includes Central America, and then it did include the Philippines, by the way, with Mexico City being its main capital or main largest city that was in that part of their colonial system. And then Peru initially, Peru really included like all of like just about South America was in it, minus Brazil. But it would later be broken up. Lima, of course, the main city, that was the capital of that. But you can see how the Portuguese had their own separate um, like colony they had in Brazil, uh, which was all because of the Treaty of Tordesillas. They were able to establish that, of course, in that area. Of course, the viceroyalties were all divided into different, like a hierarchy from top to bottom. The king obviously was the head of the whole colonial system, who ruled really from Spain. But in his place, you had what they call a viceroy. A viceroy was like a royal governor appointed by him that basically advised the chief executives and carried out all the laws, basically of basically their empire. And then under the viceroy, they had like a what they call the real audiencia, which means in Spanish, royal audience is what it means. It was a combination of like a court system with a council running basically the different aspects of their empire, not just in the Americas, but pretty much old world and Philippines and so on. They had different court systems too. You can see audiencias were the judicial councils, and then you had what they call corregidors under them, which were like municipal or local court systems that they had. Then on the bottom, you can see they had what they call the cabildo. And the cabildo was like a colonial council that basically ran the colony. Usually it was in a building called the Cabildo Building, which you may have, if you've ever been on the Jackson Square next to St. Louis Cathedral, you got the famous Cabildo Building that's down there, which is now a museum. That's where the Spanish ran the, you know, Louisiana colonial colony they had here back in the late 18th century. That's how basically they ran everything pretty much within the Spanish Empire. And of course, most people that controlled it, if you know about it, were mostly people from Spain, which I'll get to later. They're called peninsulars, is the nickname they're often called. Now, of course, one thing about the Spanish Empire, they began to break up uh, pretty much their whole empire into like a caste system, which it has different names. I think the term Spanish caste system or casta system is, I think, the English name that they use, which I think they also use that in India. That term was also kind of popular as well. But it was basically this type of system that was hierarchical system that was based off of race ethnicity, where they divided the colonial population based on their heritage, like who they're related to, and all that. And all this occurred, by the way, because of the fact that the Spanish came to the Americas, and you had different populations that were there. You had people that were Indian, you had people that were African that were brought in, and you had people that were like a mixed race that were also existing as well. So the top, you had the peninsular with the Criollo or Creoles. Then you had your mestizos. Then you had your Indians and Africans. And then you had a mixed type race like mulatto, etc., that you had as well. A lot of people like Indians, Africans were used, of course, a lot for a lot of the labor, either free labor or slave labor, of course, either one. A lot of times they use the term Creole, of course, we use, which is more of a French term, but the Spanish say Criollo is the term that they use. But yeah, the differences between the two, by the way, your peninsulars would basically be, European born Spanish, or I guess even Portuguese, that were born in the old world. They were born on the Iberian Peninsula, hence the term being used. And so these were people that were born in Spain or Portugal. And then Creoles would be people that were like mostly European that are born in America. So they would be the offspring of, say, Pizarro had children or whatever with another Spanish person. That would be considered a Criollo. But Creole is more like the French term, of course, that they used later as well. Mestizo, of course, you have that. That's a racial mixture, which is kind of a mix of European and Indian. You see that a lot in the Americas, like especially like in Mexico, etc. And so, but it all depends on the parentage. So you could be more European or more Indian. Like they had a term, like if you were more Spanish, you were called a castizo. It would be I think I've got the term, but castizo is, I think, usually considered to be three-fourths Spanish, and then you'd be one-fourth Indian, and that's what they call a castiza. And if you're a woman, it's a castiza, is what they would use. So mulatto, mulatta, the difference between, male and female, that kind of thing. Mulatto is also a term too they use. It's a racial mixture of African and European, which it could be different things: Spanish, French, Portuguese, whatever. It could be Creole, but that's basically the term they used. And I think that's still used in pretty much Latin America. That term overall. They do have what they call a Zambo, I think it's called. You may have heard of. Sometimes a derogatory term, but they do use it in Latin America still. A Zambo is something who's a mixture of like African Indian, which is kind of considered mulatto sometimes too, the way as well. But yeah, your people that are African, Indian, those two, like I said, were considered to be in the lowest part of the caste system. They are often used as the main labor force overall. So first Indians and then Africans were later brought in the 16th century. Here's, by the way, some images showing you the caste system. Actually, it's really weird, but the Spanish actually made paintings showing the difference between the different classes of people. So you can see they kind of get from light to dark. They get darker as they go down to the bottom. And so, yeah, a lot of it was based off of like their race, ethnicity, and their mixture and all that. And so you see that there, and pretty much in Latin America, and you see it a lot in, of course, North America later, and also, of course, in like in India and all that. Now they have also this thing you may have heard of called the encomienda system, which was very famous and of course was created by the Spanish. This is something. This is a system that they think was developed under Christopher Columbus when Columbus first came to the Americas. And if you know much about the encomienda system, it was really a system that was disguised as slavery. Is basically what it was. If you go back to that image right there, the idea was that Spanish colonialists that were coming to the Americas would be there to protect the Indians, make them like, Spanish, teach them Spanish, Christianize them. It was one of the, of course, main things that they used them for. By the way, Spanish colonialists that came there were often called encomienderos, I think was the term that they used. But in the end, a lot of them were used for slave labor, which it turned out to be. And they think this labor system, in a sense, along with all the European disease that they had, helped to wipe out a majority of the indigenous peoples in Latin America, which kind of debates how many it was. I think there's been all kinds of estimates about how many people died, because of the Spanish, their labor systems and so on, and the diseases. But I think the estimates range from 2 to 15 million. They're not really sure how many died. There's kind of a debate about how many indigenous peoples were in the Americas. I've seen crazy numbers as high as 100 million, but they're not really sure if it was that many that were there. But that's the estimate they had. But they do think that the income unit system was pretty much begun under the time of Columbus, and then it spread and became more like a plantation system, over time. So yeah, they think Columbus started in Hispaniola. I think was the idea of where it was, where he took all the Taino peoples, Indians there, enslaved them, and all that. But a lot of the enslavement and the diseases, of course, led to mass deaths, of basically of all those peoples. So what happened was a lot of the priests, like Catholic priests, were really just kind of they were really shocked by the the amount of deaths or decimation of the Native American populations. And so there's a very famous Spanish priest and missionary that had come to the Americas named Bartholomew de las Casas. And Las Casas was the one that really worked to have Indian slavery banned in the 16th century. And so it was all because of a series of laws that were passed in 1542 under Emperor Charles V called the New Laws of 1542. And what it did was it banned Indian slavery within a generation. And you know about Las Casas, he was involved in this famous debate in Spain that became real known. It was called the Valladolid debate. And it became this moral debate about the rights and the treatment of Native Americans in the New World. The debate was like, how should they be treated? Like other Spanish, or should they be treated like they're subhuman or slaves, that kind of thing? And there were two sides. You had Bartholomew de las Casas, who argued that basically the Spanish ought to treat them like equally because of the fact that they had converted to, Christianity, and they were trying to become more like the Spanish. And then they had another man that opposed it, Juan Gines de Sepulveda, and he said that they ought to be enslaved because the fact that they were heathens that originally weren't Christian. They had practiced human sacrifice and things like that. And so I guess he was saying that they deserve to be, enslaved and things like that. But Las Casas would eventually win out. if you know about that. Las Casas was, by the way, famous for writing a book about the Spanish, I guess, the colonial aspect of the Caribbean and how their policies led to a lot of mass deaths, where a majority of the population were killed off. And the book was called Brief Account of the Devastation of the Indies. They think that book had a lot to do with why the income unit system was later abolished. But there's a lot of irony with it. If you know about Las Casas, he is controversial because of the fact that he was one of the first to say that what they ought to do is get rid of Indian slavery and replace with African slavery, and that's what the Spanish did. If you know about that, starting between the 16th and 17th centuries, and so that's basically what led to that later. And they would use a lot of African slavery, you know about that, to work on plantations, especially with like sugar. Sugar is going to be the big thing, like sugar cane and all that. And that's something you're going to see a lot with the Portuguese and also the Spanish in the Americas. They call it white gold, if you know about that sugar. What happened was it got replaced by this other system they had, which was called the Repartimiento system, which became big in the 1500s. It was a type of labor system where they required the natives to work a specific amount of months in the year. And so it's kind of considered like a tribute labor tax, would be a kind of like what it was called. And it was kind of like a cross between, I don't know if you ever heard of the Corvée system. It was a type of labor tax system in Europe where you would have to give like so much labor to the king. It's almost like feudalism in a sense. And the Incas had something similar called the Mita tax system, where labor tax system, where basically the Incas had to give so much labor toward the Inca, like I guess for farming or whatever, throughout the year. And so it's kind of a cross between that is what it was. But a lot of people think it was like almost like disguised slavery is what it really was, in a sense. And I think a lot of the Spanish didn't really like it in the end because the fact that basically they were only working a few months out of the year. They needed to work all year round. And so what happened was the repartimiento system then evolved into like a so-called hacienda system or plantation system, which is the main thing, where they have these large, massive estates, which are used kind of like almost like in Roman times. If you remember about the Roman latifundia, like plantations they have, where they grow a lot of cash crops and they export things. And so that's basically what the hacienda system was in a sense. And the Indians were, they weren't considered slaves. They were, paid wages, but of course they were small wages. They weren't paid enough, if you know about this. And the kind of crops they grew that were big, besides sugar cane, if you know about that, cotton, coffee was big, and tobacco. And of course, also they had a lot of these hacienda systems could be not just a plantation, but could be like a factories. It could be mines, and so on. You also had like cattle ranches that were huge, sometimes called ranchos. I think was the term they used in Spanish as well. And so that's the system that the Spanish pretty much have up through the colonial system. And a lot of these systems, by the way, the hacienda is still around. Like in parts of the Americas, they still have these huge land estates, cattle ranches, or whatever that are still down there. Now, I did want to talk about one more thing too about this period. They do have the Spanish colonial period really takes off afterwards. If you know about this period, the Spanish really begin to have a colonial boom in Latin America. In fact, I think around 1810, that was the peak of the Spanish Empire, which peaked at over 5 million square miles. So it at one point was one of the largest empires in the world. The only thing about that was that there was like a lot of this negativity that was surrounded about the Spanish conquest of the Americas and the colonial system they set up. But you can see, like I said before, the massive area that they controlled at one point from like basically the western part of the United States through Mexico, Caribbean, all the way down into South America. They controlled this whole area for 330 something years or something like that at one point. But there was a so-called legend you may have heard of called the Black Legend, where some people thought that the Spanish Empire had been built on things like cruelty and so on, and the use of like slave labor, etc. But it was really considered like a anti-Catholic, anti-Spanish propaganda that was circulated throughout Europe. I think, especially by the British, but all empires, have exploited people and has been cruel also as well. But I think a lot of this kind of went back to like the Spanish Inquisition and the conquest of the Americas kind of is what kind of gave people that idea, about the Spanish and all that. But it's still a legacy that they're kind of trying to live up to in all that. Chad, you can see here the Spanish, one thing they did do, they began to exploit all the gold and silver mining. The Spanish, it was like part of why the boom happened was because of gold and silver mining, which took place in pretty much from Mexico down into Peru. And so that helped to really make a lot of people leave Spain. I think close to, I want to say something like 3 million people or more left Spain at one point and immigrated either to the Americas or to the rest of their empire as well. And so the Spanish crown took advantage of this. If you know about this, they basically taxed all the actual mineral rights and so on. And they had this tax that they called sometimes Quinto Real, or also known as Quinto del Rey, which either means royal fifth or the king's fifth. And at first, the tax was pretty high. It was like 20%, like whatever you mined or whatever. They basically taxed it at a 20% rate, although it was later declined to 10% or less over time. But that was considered a good chunk of the Spanish Empire's revenue. But the only problem with what you know about the whole Spanish Empire was that I think Castile was the only state that was really viable that made decent money. The rest of their states in Spain didn't really make much money. And so later it led to the empire decline. If you know about it, over time, their empire is really rivaled by other states that are really more powerful, like the British and the French, and so on. And so, really between the 17th and the 18th century, you start seeing the Spanish Empire really start to decline after that, which a lot of it was due to a lot of issues. They had all kinds of problems, the Spanish economic problems they had where it was not run very well financially. In fact, they had trouble with a lot of inflation like today. And in fact, I think for several times the Spanish government went bankrupt, which was kind of bad. Also, we'll get to a lot of their military losses. I think the defeat of the Spanish Armada, if you know about that, which happened in 1588, was a major issue, of course, as well. But also brain drain. In fact, a lot of people left Spain, of course, to the Americas and other parts of their empire, and that didn't help either as well. But that picture you're looking at there is kind of the root of the treasure fleets. They would have all these, Spanish galleons, these huge treasure ships that would basically ship gold, silver back and forth between the Americas and Spain. I think some of the main ports are kind of shown there, like Havana in Cuba. You got Veracruz and Acapulco, of course, in Mexico. Panama City was kind of deemed as an important port of theirs, the Spanish, as well as Lima. You can see also shows a lot of the fleets of the Portuguese too, between South America, Africa, and of course in Asia. Yeah, the Spanish, starting in the 16th century, began to build these huge multi-deck ships, which are called a galleon. The word galleon is a word that means large ship. It's really the first of these multi-deck ships that used 3 or more masts. And the average Spanish galleon might weigh up to like something like 500 tons, to give you an idea of the massive size of these ships And, compared to like the caravels and the carracks, which we had talked about before, the average crew of a Spanish galleon or any kind of galleon ship, kind of similar to that, maybe other European powers. I think the average crew was like somewhere between 2 to 300 men, to give you an idea. Of course, it was known for having a lot of guns on it. I think the average Spanish galleon had like 20 guns on each side, so 40 guns total. And so, yeah, that obviously could blast people away with that or ships. And so that's something that the Spanish used to really have naval supremacy, of course, of the world at that time. Eventually, you see here, though, kind of on the left, you got the Spanish Empire. You got, um, I kind of showed you before, but over time, the Spanish, their empire, they would lose a grip on it by the turn of the 18th into the 19th centuries. What happened was a lot of it was caused by Latin American revolutions, which occurred really starting going back to like Haiti, I think was the initial, I think, location of like some of the early rebellions. Then it spread to Mexico, then into South America. And a lot of it was spurred on by different influence, the American Revolution, the Age of Enlightenment. You also had the French Revolution. And then they say the last thing that really caused it, of course, was the um, Napoleon. Napoleon taking over France, and Napoleon at one point took over Spain and Portugal as he expanded his, Napoleonic Empire. And so that caused a lot of the peoples in Latin America to rebel against the colonial system. And so eventually you get all these different states that emerge in Latin America, which I've got a list of them here, but it's, of course, numerous ones: Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela. All those, of course, will eventually be states that will kind of emerge like around, I guess, between the 19th and 20th centuries. And a lot of those states, were heavily influenced by the Spanish, like not just their kinds of governments that they have later. The Catholic faith uh, mostly speaks Spanish, but even their not just their governments, but also even some of their court systems are kind of similar to what the Spanish had, previously. And so, yeah, a lot of Latin America today is heavily influenced by the Spanish, of course, minus Brazil. So that's kind of the whole legacy, I guess, of what happened in the Americas. Their influence there, the Spanish. I didn't really get as much into Portuguese, but the Portuguese have a lot of also influence, of course, into modern Brazil as a state. Because Brazil later break away too. It'll become like the Empire of Brazil in the 19th century, and now I think it's now like a republican type state today overall. So that's it lecture wise, of course, on the conquest of America. Next week, I'll be moving on to talk about the Reformation, and it's kind of taking me a while to get to that. I'm kind of doing it out of order this semester, but I'll talk about the rise of Protestantism in Europe. That starts in Germany because of a famous man named Martin Luther. So we'll talk about that, and I'll talk about the spread of Protestantism throughout Europe. We'll also talk about the different conflicts that led to it, like the 30 Years' War, I think, which was one of the bloodiest conflicts, of course, that was in that, conflict in Europe. Before I go, don't forget, I do have the new quiz out, Conquest of America quiz, which I guess we do sometime next week. But you got the expiration of quiz. I know it's still up right now. I think that's due this week. So don't forget to wrap up on that if you haven't done that yet. And then I also have Canvas discussions as well. So I've got those also for extra credit. And I know next week, I know we have the first vocab coming up. I'll try to put up the new one as well this week. But that's it overall. I know it was a short week for y'all, but I hope y'all have a good weekend coming up. And of course, we'll see you next week. Don't look like there's any comments today or questions, of course, toward this lecture. But if you have a comment, question, you can always leave me a comment either here or, of course, or on campus. So y'all take care and have a great rest of the week.